Hi everyone, I'm Ava and welcome back to your financial journey. With all that's been going on in the economy lately, from tariffs to inflation to government spending, there's been a lot of attention given to what President Trump's economic policies and goals are. But President Trump has built a close-knit circle of advisors for his second term who guide and counsel him on policy. And one of the people who seems to have the president's ear is also one of the least known ones. And that's his Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent. Formerly an investor and hedge fund manager, Bessent now has the responsibility of advising President Trump on economic policy, managing the nation's finances and debt, supervising financial institutions, and serving as the Chief Financial Officer of the U.S. government. Plus, he's emerged as one of the leading figures in President Trump's tariff and deregulatory agenda. Despite Bessent's significant role, a lot of people don't know what his actual viewpoints and convictions are, or how he was chosen for the role. And that's why, in today's video, we'll be covering who Scott Bessent actually is. We'll go into his early life and education, his career as an investor and hedge fund manager, and his appointment as Secretary of the Treasury. Let's get started. Bessent's early life and education. Scott Bessent was born in South Carolina on August 21, 1962, and he grew up there in the little fishing village of Little River, not too far from Myrtle Beach. His father was a real estate investor who was always going through cycles of boom and bust. His income wasn't stable and reliable, and his family could never be certain of how much money they'd have in any given year. And for Bessent, that meant growing up with a constant sense of financial anxiety. That uncertainty about his family's income wasn't fun to deal with as a child, but it was formative for him. Later on in his career, he said that knowing what financial anxiety feels like was key to his success. Before Bessent became successful, though, he started as many investors do, and that was by pursuing a higher education. He attended Yale University and was first interested in becoming a journalist. In his pursuits, he applied to become the editor of the Yale Daily News. But after he didn't get the job, he wasn't so sure about working in the news business anymore. He began looking for other possible career paths, and soon he got an internship with Jim Rogers, a well-known money manager and business partner of George Soros. Bessent was just looking for something to try. In fact, later on, he said that part of the reason he took the internship in the first place was because Jim Rogers even offered, which was key for me, a place to stay on the office sofa. But that internship and that office sofa were what got Bessent into the world of finance and investing, where he would eventually thrive. Career as investor and hedge fund manager. Bessent graduated from Yale in 1984 with a Bachelor of Arts degree, after which he worked first at Brown Brothers Harriman, a private investment bank, and then under the famed short seller Jim Chanos at Kynikos Associates. And in 1991, Bessent joined Soros Fund Management, the famed hedge fund of billionaire George Soros. That was Bessent's first big break. At Soros Fund Management, Bessent became known for his sharp analytical skills, strategic thinking, and deep understanding of macroeconomics. That helped him become part of George Soros' inner circle and even the head of the fund's London office. And in 1992, there was a lot going on in London's financial markets. A few years before, the United Kingdom had joined the ERM, or European Exchange Rate Mechanism, which tied the pound to other European currencies with fixed exchange rates. 1 pound was supposed to be worth about 3 Deutschmark, German marks, at all times. To maintain that fixed exchange rate, the British government had to intervene to keep the currency stable if its exchange rate was too far out of the limit established by the ERM. So far, so good. And businesses and tourists alike appreciated having the certainty that 1 pound was always worth about 3 Deutschmark. But there was a problem. Because the pound was now tied to the Deutschmark at a fixed exchange rate, the pound appreciated or gained value every time that the Deutschmark appreciated. And back in the early 1990s, Germany had one of the world's strongest economies, meaning that happened a lot. But Britain's own economy wasn't very strong, which meant that the pound became way overvalued. In other words, no currency trader actually thought the pound was worth 3 Deutschmark. It was thought to be worth much less. So over time, the government became the only actor prepared to pay 3 Deutschmark for 1 pound, and it had to spend huge amounts trying to keep the currency within its required range. To buy ever-increasing amounts of British pounds at an exchange rate of 3 Deutschmark, the British government had to spend a lot of money, and a lot of Deutschmarks in particular. Initially, the British government, acting via the Bank of England, its central bank, had large foreign currency reserves, or huge amounts of money that a government keeps to help manage its currency. But at some point, even the Bank of England's once huge currency reserves started to run out. And Bessent and Soros Fund Management saw an opportunity. They speculated that the British government would soon have to withdraw from the ERM, which would cause the pound to plummet from its overvalued state to a lower value reflecting its actual strength. So on September 16th, a date that later became known as Black Wednesday, they bet heavily against the pound. With over $10 billion, they shorted the currency, or predicted that it was going to plummet. What Soros and Bessent did was sell huge amounts of British pounds that they didn't have for 3 Deutschmark per pound. But, and here comes the bet they made, they had a bit of time to actually deliver the pounds that they had just sold short, as the market calls it. And Soros and Bessent were hoping that by the time they had to actually deliver the pounds to the buyers, they would be worth much less, say 2.5 Deutschmark per pound. If that strategy worked, Soros and Bessent would make a killing. They would get 3 Deutschmark for every pound they had just sold, but if the pound was devalued, made cheaper, they would be able to buy these pounds in the market for just 2.5 Deutschmark. This bet also meant that they, as private investors, were betting against the British government and the Bank of England, one of the oldest and largest central banks in the world. Something that was unheard of at the time. When they saw what was happening, the British government and the Bank of England tried everything they could to stabilize the pound and keep it at a rate of 3 Deutschmark per pound. First, as people were selling their pounds, the Bank of England kept buying them at the fixed exchange rate of 3 Deutschmark per pound. But as people sold more and more, the Bank of England had to buy more and more. And finally, it ran out of Deutschmark to spend. And then they raised interest rates, first to 12% and then to 15%, in the hope that if people saw they could get such attractive interest rates on their pounds, they'd want to keep them. But still, people kept selling. Nobody seemed to have faith in the British currency. So at the end of the day, the British government gave in and withdrew the pound from the ERM, meaning that if people wanted to sell their pounds, the Bank of England wouldn't pay 3 Deutschmark for each of them anymore, but that the seller would have to find a willing buyer on the open market. That caused the pound to plunge. Instead of having to pay 3 Deutschmark for a pound, as it had been with the fixed exchange rate, you could now get a pound for as little as 2.4 Deutschmark. That meant that the bet against the pound, the British government, and the Bank of England had worked. Soros and Bessent collected their 3 Deutschmark per pound from the initial sales contracts, but they could now buy these pounds for just 2.4 Deutschmark before they had to actually deliver the pounds to the buyers, and made over $1 billion in net profit from doing so. Headlines all over the world screamed that George Soros broke the Bank of England, and Bessent was one of the leading members of the team who had made it possible. The bet against the pound worked in large part thanks to Bessent's ability to identify trends before they became headlines. He had spotted weaknesses in the British housing market long before others began to notice issues, which allowed the hedge fund to make predictions early on. In the UK, the pound's freefall on Black Wednesday damaged the then Conservative government's credibility enough to cost them the next election in a landslide. But in the long term, the crisis may have helped the country, because devaluing the pound from other currencies made British exports cheaper and enabled the economy to rebound in the following years. Bessent left Soros Fund Management in 2000, after which he founded his own hedge fund. It had mixed success and closed just 5 years later in 2005. But Bessent said afterward that he learned that I shouldn't change my style or the construct of my firm because of investor preferences, and that would be an important lesson for later on. From 2006 to 2011, Bessent spent some time teaching economic history and lectures at his alma mater, Yale. He wasn't finished with hedge funds, though, because in 2011, he returned to Soros Fund Management once again, and this time as the fund's chief investment officer, at the helm of the fund's more than $25 billion worth of assets. Under Bessent's leadership, the fund reportedly averaged double-digit annual returns, even in the volatile period after the Great Financial Crisis of 2008, or the Great Recession. Bessent's combination of top-down macro analysis, real-time market awareness, and willingness to make big, conviction-driven bets made that possible. Those abilities would help Bessent in making a second big move, and that was a bet against the Japanese yen in 2013, because it seems like breaking the Bank of England just wasn't enough for him. At the time, Shinzo Abe had been elected as Japan's prime minister for a second time, and he had plans to revive Japan's then deflationary economy. Bessent predicted that those efforts would succeed, which would also result in the yen losing value and Japanese stocks rising. His knack for predicting markets' vulnerabilities and anticipating where capital would flow next ended up being right once again. And those bets against the yen ended up earning the fund over $1.2 billion. In 2015, Bessent stepped down from Soros Fund Management for the second time to launch his own firm, called Key Square Group. Bessent raised $4.5 billion to start his fund, of which $2 billion came from George Soros, a testament to the confidence the billionaire had in Bessent's capabilities. The hedge fund had a unique approach of making macro investments by observing geopolitical and capital trends and translating them into market positions. That helped it succeed at first, because at its peak in 2017, the hedge fund managed over $5 billion worth of assets, and Bessent was routinely listed among the most influential macro investors in the world. Soon, though, the hedge fund began to decline. In 2018, Key Square Group returned the $2 billion that Soros had invested back to him, and for the next few years, its investments failed to make large returns, even while global stock markets were doing great. And while it once again made a profit in 2021 and the years after, investors got antsy. By 2023, Key Square Group was down to managing a little over $500 million worth of assets, around a tenth of what it had once managed at its peak. And at the same time, the number of investors it had shrunk to nearly a ninth of what it had been in 2017. Those weren't great developments for Bessent. But in the end, it seems he got over it quickly, because soon, Bessent would go from being famous on Wall Street to being famous all over America. And that would come through entering the world of politics. Appointment as Secretary of the Treasury. Long before Bessent got announced as Trump's pick for Secretary of the Treasury, he'd been making himself known in Trump's inner circle. While he wasn't a part of Trump's first campaign or term, he was one of the first business leaders to back Trump. Even as Trump was dealing with legal problems, Bessent was acting as an economic advisor to his 2024 presidential campaign, personally donating millions of dollars to him and helping fundraise over $50 million. During that time, he also began to share his economic views and ideas, including outlining a 3-point economic plan that would involve cutting the budget deficit to 3% of GDP, growing GDP by 3%, and generating an additional 3 million barrels of oil every day. And in regards to Trump's policies, Bessent expressed support for tariffs and deregulation. That meant that when President Trump won the election in 2024, Bessent was one of the front-runners for Secretary of the Treasury. But there was no guarantee he would get the job, because he was up against Howard Lutnick, fellow businessman and the CEO of renowned investment bank Cantor Fitzgerald. The two former Wall Street figures and successful investors each began campaigning for the same position, giving interviews and writing articles to convince President Trump that they were the better pick. It was pretty standard campaigning at first, but it soon turned into a messier, more public affair. That was thanks to none other than tech billionaire Elon Musk, who posted on X, "Would be interesting to hear more people weigh in on this for real Donald Trump to consider feedback. My view is that Bessent is a business-as-usual choice, whereas Howard Lutnick will actually enact change." Given Musk's influence on Trump, that wasn't exactly great news for Bessent. Though let's face it, it's probably because Musk hardly ever opts for what would be considered the business-as-usual choice. And be sure to check out this video here if you want to learn more about how Musk made his massive fortune. Back to Bessent, though. Things looked even worse for him when Robert F. Kennedy, Trump's pick for Secretary of Health and Human Services, posted in support of Lutnick too. And soon, it seemed everyone was posting their own opinion on the matter. Those in economics and finance, but also those completely outside of the fields. President Trump wasn't too happy with the attention being paid to his pick for Secretary of the Treasury, and he even started looking for other potential candidates, including former Federal Reserve Governor Kevin Warsh, Senator Bill Hagerty of Tennessee, and CEO of Apollo Global Management, which is another hedge fund, Mark Rowan. Amidst all the turmoil of there being countless potential picks for the job, numerous Trump advisors favoring Lutnick, and mixed opinions everywhere, nobody was sure who President Trump was going to choose. And yet, on November 22, 2024, he posted on Truth Social announcing that Scott Bessent was his pick for Secretary of the Treasury. And the Senate confirmed President Trump's nomination in January of 2025, officially making Scott Bessent the Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. So why did President Trump eventually decide on Bessent? Well, it came down to Bessent's economic background and proposed policies. In particular, Bessent is a key advocate for deregulation and deficit reduction. He's repeatedly said that the U.S. economy needs a detox, meaning that it's too reliant on government spending and that the U.S.'s massive federal debt needs to be brought under control. He wrote in a Wall Street Journal opinion article that economic growth is propped up by the out-of-control federal deficit, and that Mr. Trump has a mandate to reprivatize the U.S. economy through deregulation and tax reform. Those are views that President Trump, and many Americans, agree with, which may largely explain why Bessent might have been chosen. And with his proposed 3-point economic plan, it's likely that he'll spend the next few years trying to combat those issues and reduce the U.S. government's role in the economy. But what some believe really gave Bessent the advantage over Lutnick was the reassurance he gave Wall Street. While many economists criticized President Trump's tariff plans as inflationary, and many investors worried they would lead to less growth, Bessent supported the proposals. And with his reputation for investing and understanding markets, that helped lend them credence. In a separate opinion article published in Fox News, he argued that tariffs could be used to achieve foreign policy goals, raise government revenue as an alternative to taxes, and protect manufacturing and strategic industries in America. And even while Bessent was expressing his support for President Trump's tariffs, he was more moderate on the issue than Lutnick. So his selection as Secretary of the Treasury reassured people on Wall Street and in the markets, because they believed he'd be a moderating figure in President Trump's cabinet and prevent any too outlandish economic policies from being implemented. Now, at the time of this taping, Bessent has emerged as a leading figure in negotiations with foreign governments following President Trump's recent implementation of new tariffs. Bessent has encouraged countries to negotiate instead of retaliating, saying, "My advice to every country right now is do not retaliate. Sit back, take it in, let's see how it goes. Because if you retaliate, there will be escalation." Whatever happens in the coming months and years, it seems likely that Bessent will play a large role in influencing the U.S. economy and fiscal policy. And he certainly has his work cut out for him, because leading Trump's economic agenda of implementing tariffs, cutting taxes, and making sweeping deregulations is no easy task, especially given that major parts of that agenda could contradict each other. But he also has the experience that would have prepared him for the job. From a fishing village in South Carolina, Bessent was able to join the world of finance and investing and rise to the very top. He managed billions of dollars of assets, and his investments affected the economies of entire countries. And now, as Secretary of the Treasury, he could make decisions that affect the entire global economy. How do you think Scott Bessent's policies will impact the U.S. economy? Drop a comment below to let us know. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you again next time.